Her crown slipped, but the blood never stopped flowing. Welcome to Buried Edge. I'm your host. Drop a comment with your location. I always love hearing from you. Your voice keeps this journey alive. Let's uncover the truth. The wind howled through the stone corridors of St. James's Palace like a dirge whispered by the dying. Beneath the canopy of crimson drapery, she lay rigid, cloaked in sweat, swaddled in velvet that clung like burial shrouds to her frail, mottled limbs. Her fingers, once kissed by bishops and courtiers, were now twisted and translucent, curled like brittle twigs clutching at nothing. The stench of rotting flesh mingled with the faint odor of spilled communion wine and burned tallow. Blood pooled beneath her body, not from a wound, but from within, slow and black and defiant. The crown had not fallen, it had sunk into her bones. Outside her chamber, a court waited not in mourning, but in calculation, boots pacing, parchments rustling, heads bowed not in reverence, but in strategy. England was holding its breath, not in sorrow, but anticipation. The queen who had bled the Protestants dry, who had ignited pyres in the name of salvation, was herself burning from the inside. Her abdomen, distended and purple, swelled with phantom children that had never lived, a grotesque echo of the empire she tried to birth in fire. And in her ears, they said, she heard the screams of the martyrs, smelled their charred bones, saw the faces peeling from flesh in the inferno she herself had ordered. This was not divine justice. This was the theater of decay. This was not mercy. This was precision. She was born into blood, not merely the noble blood of Tudor lineage, but the blood of conflict, of severed allegiances, of prayers curdling into curses. Mary, the only surviving child of Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII, entered the world in 1516 beneath the weight of expectation and the shadow of disappointment. A daughter was not what England had demanded, but she was named for the Virgin nonetheless, as if sanctity might one day forgive her for not being a son. Her childhood was gilded with papal blessings and Spanish pride, for Catherine's Habsburg blood ran thick and devout, trained to kneel before Rome and raise kingdoms from relics. Mary was a scholar of Latin, a prodigy in music, and a daughter of rigid decorum. But even as she bowed at her mother's feet, the crown upon her father's head began to tarnish with lust and rebellion. Henry's yearning for Anne Boleyn would become an ecclesiastical rupture, a violence against both wife and church that tore Mary from her mother's arms and spat her into bastardhood. Stripped of her title, she was forced to serve in the household of the infant Elizabeth, the daughter of the woman who replaced her mother's sanctified womb with the poisoned chalice of seduction. Mary's defiance calcified in the shadows. She refused to call her father's new queen anything but whore. She refused to renounce her legitimacy. She refused to forget. Years passed as a slow, grinding penance. While her father split the soul of England from Rome, Mary remained a living remnant of the old religion. She clung to the Latin Mass, the solemn bells of Catholicism, the sacraments that tasted of exile. She was a woman formed by subtraction, motherless, stateless, childless, while the nation turned its face toward reform. Even after Henry's death and the reign of her young brother Edward, Protestantism was no longer a doctrine. It was a scaffold on which her very existence now hung. Yet when Edward died in 1553 and those around him scrambled to place Lady Jane Grey upon the throne, it was Mary who moved with a strange Marian fury. From the fortress of Framlingham, she summoned a rebellion not with the edge of the sword, but with the sanctity of her name. The people still remembered her mother, the piety, the dignity, the Spanish lioness in exile. They rallied not for politics, but for prophecy. Mary swept into London to the clang of cathedral bells and incense-thick air. Jane's 9-day reign crumbled without battle. Mary was crowned with a gold cross and crowned again with vengeance. Her reign began with proclamations of unity and peace, but beneath them coiled the ancient creed of retribution. She would not rule merely as a queen. She would rule as a daughter wronged, as a disciple denied. Her marriage to Philip II of Spain, a union drenched in papal approval and imperial ambition, was not merely romantic. It was salvific. Together, they would scour heretics from the kingdom. Together, they would restore England to Rome. The fire was lit in 1555, and from that moment, her name began to curdle on the tongues of her subjects. She had burned Protestants, scholars, bishops, wives heavy with child. She had watched the flames consume their limbs and dared to call it purification. The Marian burnings, over 200 in number, were not merely executions. They were public spectacles of religious absolution by agony. As the heretics screamed, she prayed. As the flesh blistered and blackened, she wept not for them, but for the sins they refused to renounce. And yet, for all her fervor, her throne remained brittle. Her people feared her, but did not follow. The joy that had crowned her return had evaporated into cinders. Her marriage to Philip bore no heir. Only rumors, humiliations, and false pregnancies that swelled her belly with nothing but hope turned gangrenous. Each month that passed without a child was another tick in the ledger of God's silence. And England, restless and watching, began to prepare for her undoing. The country did not yet know they were witnessing the descent of a queen into haunted flesh. But in the palaces and the parishes, in the glances of diplomats and the silence of courtiers, it had already begun. The unraveling. The blood of her enemies was not enough. Now it would be her own. The body of a queen is never her own. It is a relic, a vessel, a battleground of expectation and divine inheritance. But Mary's body had begun to rebel. What once stood erect in the embroidered armor of legitimacy now curled inward, folding into itself with silent corrosion. Her skin, pallid and bruised, bore the marks of an unseen affliction. Her hair thinned, her breath grew sour with decay, and within her abdomen something pulsed, not life, but a distension, a grotesque mimicry of gestation, a theater of fertility played out in ruin. The phantom pregnancy of 1555 was not merely a personal tragedy. It was a public betrayal, a symbolic death masked as hope. For months, her courtiers celebrated the swelling of her womb, constructing tapestries, gathering midwives, preparing cannon salutes for a child who did not exist. But as the weeks turned into months and her belly ceased to rise, the kingdom's joy rotted into suspicion. No infant cried from the cradle. No heir lay swaddled in Tudor silk. Only silence, broken by the rustle of discarded papal blessings and Philip's heavy footsteps fading toward the continent. She believed she had quickened. She had spoken of flutterings, of divine movement, of sacred signs. She had demanded daily prayers for the unborn prince who would weld England to God. But the child never came. Instead, the bulge receded like a tide, leaving behind the bitter sand of shame and whispers. Physicians, their hands trembling, offered euphemisms, retention of menses, abdominal congestion, a melancholic imbalance. But the truth was buried in shame. Her womb had become a tomb. It was then that the ghosts began to speak more clearly, not from shadows, but from within her, echoes of Catherine's tears, of Anne's jeering smile, of Elizabeth's silent eyes. She became obsessed with ritual, mass upon mass, relic upon relic, as if layers of incense might obscure the rot. She ordered the nails of martyrs to be delivered to her chambers. She pressed rosaries to her swollen belly. Her prayers ceased to ask. They now begged. Each hour not spent in devotion was an hour spent in dread, of another failed bleeding, of another servant's glance, of another echo in her ear of burning flesh and crackling bone. Her letters became erratic, their margins stained with ink and sweat. She chastised bishops for laxity. She demanded more burnings. She summoned the ghosts of Spain to surround her in flesh, ambassadors, confessors, courtiers whose presence made her court feel less English, less hostile, less foreign to the woman who had never truly belonged to her own island. She saw betrayal everywhere, even in the eyes of her own sister. Elizabeth, the daughter of the concubine, as Mary still called her in private, had been tolerated but never trusted. Tall, poised, her hair aflame against England's greying skies, Elizabeth had come to symbolize the very thing Mary feared most: renewal. And so Mary watched her carefully, sending spies cloaked in holy duty, tracking each visitor, each letter. Even smiles were interrogated. Yet the more Mary punished, the more isolated she became. Philip had returned to Spain, writing infrequently, more consumed with the affairs of empire than the woman who had offered him her throne and her lifeblood. He called her sister, he called her pious. But he did not call her wife. And in the emptiness of his absence, Mary withered. Love had been replaced by sacrament, desire by austerity. She believed that suffering itself was sacred, that her infertility, her pain, her isolation were not punishments, but offerings. In her chambers, she whispered that Christ too had bled without birth, had been abandoned, had died unloved. She did not recognize this as madness. She believed it to be likeness. And all the while, the kingdom breathed her decline. Her laws, increasingly severe, cracked against the hearts of her subjects. The prisons swelled. The fires in Smithfield were never cold. In one winter alone, 50 were burned, men who refused the Eucharist, women who held English Bibles, old ministers with cracked voices who could no longer kneel. These were not criminals. They were symbols. And Mary, now hollowed by loss and dread, did not merely allow their deaths. She anointed them with purpose. But the horror she unleashed returned in kind. Crowds who once wept now turned their backs. Children whispered tales of a queen whose insides had rotted from sin. Ballads circulated of her eyes glowing red in the dark, of her womb full of serpents, of her shadow crossing thresholds and leaving blood behind. She had become a creature of her own myth, a monarch fashioned not of flesh, but of flame and fear. Her reflection no longer resembled the daughter of Catherine. Her cheeks sunken, her fingers blackened at the tips, her breath shallow as though God himself had grown weary of filling her lungs. Still she prayed. Still she ruled. Still she waited for a child who would never come and a husband who had already left. This was not sovereignty. This was martyrdom ritualized in reverse, and it would only end in blood. It began, not with a cry, but with a silence that no one could name. In the final weeks of her reign, Mary Tudor ceased to speak aloud in her own tongue. Her voice, once thunderous in prayer and decree, had retreated into a dry murmur that fell somewhere between penance and possession. The courtiers avoided her chamber unless summoned. Physicians stood at her bedside not as healers, but as witnesses to a prolonged undoing. The air around her grew foul, thick with the stench of ulcers and excrement masked poorly by perfumed linens and rose water. Her death, it seemed, had chosen not to arrive in a single violent storm, but in slow, methodical waves. She did not die as the Protestants had, stripped and burned before an audience of shouting strangers. She died as a prisoner within her own throne, consumed from the inside. Her body, wasted by fever and decay, ballooned grotesquely around the abdomen, the skin stretched thin and bruised as though her flesh bore the memory of the child she had never born. Gangrene set into her legs, her urine turned black. She had to be turned with silk gloves, for her skin tore like wet parchment. Her nails detached, her gums bled without contact. This was no mere illness. It was a pageant of divine reckoning, a deterioration orchestrated with such gruesome symmetry that even the most devout among her attendants began to question whether the fires she had lit were now licking at her soul. She lingered in agony, each hour a new dissection of dignity. Her attendants noted her breath became ragged, marked by pauses so long they prepared to mourn her, only for her lungs to drag in one more corrupted breath. Her eyes turned upward, rolled back as if chasing the memory of God through the rafters. She began to speak to phantoms. She called for Catherine, for Philip, for children that had never lived, and for martyrs who had perished by her command. Some swore she spoke in Latin. Others believed it was not speech at all, but the tongues of the damned whispered through rotting lips. Still they remained, kneeling in the shadow of her decay, half believing her agony might birth a miracle. But it was not sanctity that arrived. It was blood. On the 5th night of her final illness, she began to hemorrhage from the womb. A slow, viscous seepage of dark fluid that soaked through her royal bedding and trailed down her thighs like a procession of sorrow. Her ladies, trained in silence, said nothing, but their hands trembled as they sponged her flesh, each motion a desecration of sacred body. The chamber grew colder. The fire, no matter how stoked, refused to warm her limbs. And still, the bells of Westminster tolled for daily mass, as if time dared to proceed as her body unraveled. She made her confessions with a breath too faint for record. Her soul, she believed, still had weight. Her sins, if she named them, were shrouded in divine logic, wrapped in the vestments of doctrine and vengeance. She did not recant. She did not regret. She clung to her God with the fierce grip of a woman who had sacrificed not only her enemies, but herself. To suffer was to mirror Christ. To bleed was to prove her sanctity. On November 17th, 1558, the moment came not with a cry or a shudder, but with a final exhalation that seemed to hang in the air like incense, heavy and invisible. Her eyes did not close. They remained open, bloodshot and glazed, staring past the embroidered canopy towards something no one else could see. A priest administered the last rites, his voice cracking as he anointed a corpse that still clung to pulse. The silence that followed was suffocating. No crowd screamed, no fire burned, no bells tolled. England, it seemed, had already begun to forget her. Her body, fragile and bloated, was wrapped in layers of velvet and sealed in a coffin lined with lead, a containment not only of decay, but of memory. For 6 weeks she lay in state beneath the vaulted ceilings of Westminster Abbey, guarded not by weeping mourners, but by protocol. Few dared to kneel beside her. Fewer still offered prayers. Those who came did so out of obligation, eyes flickering toward the future even as her corpse haunted the present. The procession to her grave was conducted with pageantry, but not passion. 1,000 torches lit the way, yet none could dispel the cold. Her crown, placed beside her body, seemed heavier than before, as if weighted by ash. The choir sang Latin requiems over the queen who had tried to drag her nation back into the grave with her. And when her coffin was lowered into the vault, a hush fell, not out of reverence, but of relief. There were no riots. There was no vengeance for the vengeance she had enacted. The country did not rise in rebellion or drown itself in grief. Instead, it exhaled. It turned its face toward the flame-haired sister waiting beyond the veil of ceremony. Elizabeth, the Protestant, the daughter of Anne, would ascend, and Mary would sink. But even in burial, she resisted. Her body, sealed in lead, would remain preserved longer than her reputation. Her bloodline ended with her. Her name became a curse, and yet her rot, her fire, her death by unbirth, these would linger, not as history, as warning. The death of Mary Tudor did not bring England to its knees. It brought the nation to its feet. The air had barely cleared from her final breath when the machinery of succession, long prepared in secret and silence, roared into motion. Elizabeth was proclaimed queen the very morning Mary was declared dead, and the crowds that had once cowered beneath a Catholic cross now burst into spontaneous cheer. The bells that had refused to toll for Mary's soul rang jubilant peals for her sister's rise. In London, bonfires were lit, not for martyrdom, but for celebration. Not a week had passed before portraits of the new queen adorned merchant stalls and tavern walls, as if the old reign had never taken root in memory. There were no mass funerals for the burned, no canonizations for the martyrs, but they lingered, names murmured in parishes and whispered in kitchens, branded into the imagination of a generation that had learned what the scent of sanctified flesh truly meant. Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley, Thomas Cranmer. They had been made into ash, and yet their shadows now gathered behind the new monarch like spectral advisors. The scorched bones of Mary's victims had become, in death, more powerful than her decrees in life. Mary's death was not marked by public lamentation, but by careful erasure. Her banners were removed from state halls with astonishing haste. Her symbols of Catholic legitimacy, rosary-laden insignias, crucifix motifs, Latin mottos, were stripped from public view. Even her coinage was recalled. Parliament did not weep, it resumed. Courtiers who had feigned allegiance to her regime recited the oath of supremacy for Elizabeth with a speed that betrayed the brittle loyalty they had once professed. Bishops were replaced, altars dismantled, the Latin Mass outlawed within months. Only in certain corners, among aging Spanish retainers, cloistered nuns, and the dying remnants of the old Catholic gentry, did Mary's name remain spoken with reverence. They believed she had suffered for righteousness, that her fire had failed not because of its sin, but because of the sin it had tried to cleanse. But these voices were few, and they grew quieter with each year. In Spain, Philip II received news of Mary's death with formality, but without grief. He offered Elizabeth his hand in marriage before the final candle had been extinguished over Mary's coffin. To him, the union had always been imperial, not intimate. His letters to Mary in her final years had grown cold, clinical, full of politics and bereft of affection. She had offered him her throne, her body, her soul. He had given her a crown's approval and silence. The city of London, which had once watched the fires at Smithfield in terrified awe, now buried those memories beneath the noise of coronation parades and Protestant sermons. The theatres reopened. The royal court shimmered again with music and metaphor. A new queen smiled, red-haired and resolute, and the nation followed. Not because they believed, but because they had survived. And so Mary slipped away, not only from the throne, but from the hearts of her people. She had ruled as a weapon, sharp, pious, and unrelenting, and now she was sheathed, forgotten in the velvet dark. There would be no sainthood, no holy relics of her reign would be preserved, save the lead coffin that sealed her rot from the air. No children would bear her name, no poems would sing her virtues. In state records, she was noted simply, Queen Mary I died childless, November 17th, 1558. But even in forgetting, England had not truly escaped her. The smell of burning flesh had sunk into the soil, the shadow of her pyres stretched forward, and her death, slow, bloody, and alone, would become a caution woven into the marrow of the monarchy itself. She was not mourned, she was erased, and yet erasure rarely succeeds in silence. Mary's legacy did not vanish. It fermented, like stagnant water beneath a sealed crypt, its odor leaking through generations. The title history assigned her, Bloody Mary, was not born from her reign alone, but from the memory constructed afterward, meticulously crafted by Protestant chroniclers and Elizabethan poets who painted her in fire and failure. She was made monstrous in retrospect, her name transformed into a ritualized horror, a whisper spoken before mirrors by children who did not know her but knew what burning meant. The symbolism of her death took shape not in scripture, but in metaphor. Mary became a cautionary tale, not merely of cruelty, but of conviction without mercy. Her bloodline ended with her. Her crown passed not to a child, but to a doctrine opposed to her own. Her reign became a bruise on the Tudor body politic, a sacred infection cauterized by Elizabeth's ascendancy. The fires she had lit, intended to purify, were remembered not as sacraments, but as spectacles of degradation. The martyrs she condemned rose in legend as saints of the English soul, while Mary's faith became synonymous with tyranny. Yet even in vilification she endured. In every recusant chapel hidden behind tavern doors, in every whispered Hail Mary under the surveillance of Protestant law, her ghost lingered, half saint, half scourge. To some, she remained the last true Catholic monarch of England, the queen who bled for Rome when the rest of the island knelt to compromise. Her suffering, grotesque as it had been, became a kind of perverse martyrdom, not for heretics, but for those who believed that England's soul had been lost with her death. The physical legacy she left was sparse. No heir, no monuments erected in her name, no dynasties trailing her memory. And yet her grave lies not in isolation, but beside her sister, entombed within the marble silence of Westminster Abbey. The inscription bears not her triumphs, but Elizabeth's. Consorts in throne and grave, sisters in blood, divided in belief. There, in the cool darkness beneath the stone, their bones share a space their spirits never did. One ruled in fire, the other in light, but both shaped the altar of English history. Her face, hollowed by illness, stained by sorrow, faded from portraiture. Painters turned their brushes to Elizabeth's powdered radiance, to goddesses cloaked in pearls, to monarchs carved in the likeness of empire. Mary's features became unrecorded wounds. The few surviving likenesses, stern, pale, rigid, seemed more funerary than regal. She would not be remembered as beautiful, nor beloved. She would be remembered as a warning. But there is power in warning. Power in the myth of blood. In every monarch who knelt too close to dogma, in every ruler tempted to cleanse by flame, Mary's name rang like a bell beneath the surface, a reminder that thrones built on righteousness must answer for their ashes. The tyranny of mercy, the zealotry of belief, the rot of unmet desire, she embodied them all. And still, the ghost walks. In history books, in nursery rhymes, in the quiet dread of nations that punish dissent with holiness. Her crown may have tarnished, her womb may have betrayed, her name may have blackened, but her legend, paradoxically, endured not despite her failure, but because of it. She was not simply England's blood queen. She was its mirror, held to the face of power, showing what faith looks like when it forgets to flinch. History did not absolve her. It ossified her. Mary Tudor became not a woman, but a silhouette burnt into the fabric of a nation's fear, an outline of piety hardened into cruelty, of devotion metastasized into retribution. She ceased to be flesh, and instead became echo, a prayer unanswered, a throne gone barren, a fire that refused to die cleanly. Her crown passed to her sister, but her shadow never did. Even in the era that followed, resplendent in Golden Age rhetoric, draped in Shakespearean poetry and imperial bloom, the smoke from Smithfield still lingered behind the arras. Elizabeth might have washed the altars, rewritten the rites, rebranded the scepter, but she could not wholly cleanse the air. Mary had scorched her creed into the memory of the monarchy. Not through success, but through severity. Not through love, but through dread. It is fitting, perhaps, that no child bore her name with pride, that no dynasty sprang from her body, that no house flew her banner after her bones were interred. She had tried to birth a nation of faith, and instead delivered only funerals. She wanted to be remembered as the restorer of the old church, the savior of a fallen flock. But what survives is the image of fire against grey skies, of women bound to stakes, of scripture turned to scream. And yet, one must ask, was she not merely a mirror held to her world? Did she not inherit her father's appetite for dominance, cloaked in righteousness, her mother's exile, her husband's indifference, her brother's erasure? The England she ruled had already been wounded, its soul cleaved by divorce, its crown built upon annulment and oath-breaking. Mary did not invent the violence. She inherited it and baptized it. Her tragedy, then, was not just in what she did, but in what she believed she had to do. She believed her suffering sanctified her. That pain was proof of holy labor, that burning the body was merely the cost of saving the soul. It was not madness, it was conviction stripped of compassion. And that is what made her reign so terrifying, because it was not monstrous, it was devout. In the centuries that followed, her story would be rewritten with every age that feared extremism. In Victorian texts, she was grotesque, gendered in her hysteria, villainized as both too woman and not woman enough. In Catholic histories, she was tragic, a ruler undone by loss, betrayed by time. In modern retellings, she flickers still between victim and tyrant, a wound that never scabs, a lesson no one fully learns. And so she remains, not in statues, not in scripture, but in the murmur of her name before mirrors, in the faint hiss of unseen fire, in the spectral weight of crowns passed down like curses. Mary, Mary, quite contrary. The nursery rhyme survives longer than the edicts, longer than the tombs, longer than the Latin prayers. A child's chant with a queen's corpse buried inside it. The coffin is sealed, the lead is cold, but the legacy is not. This was not closure, this was echo. This was not peace, this was remembrance.